much. I'm honored to be here. How to make machines that are conscious and really feel. So most people think consciousness is something very special. Some new and as yet unknown mechanism is necessary to explain it and then to build it into a machine. So it looks like we are very far from making conscious machines. That's wrong. I'm going to try and convince you that that's wrong. And we're very close to making conscious machines. But to do that, I have to start by clarifying what we mean by consciousness. I'll distinguish three aspects. And the phenomenal conscious aspect is what seems hard and leads people to believe that conscious machines are a long way off. But then I'll introduce the sensorimotor approach. It makes phenomenal consciousness easy. And I'll describe some applications, and then I'll conclude that consciousness is immanent, and that there are grave ethical problems. So let's start with the definition. The problem with consciousness is that people use the word in so many different ways. And in fact, they use the word to their own advantage, to discriminate against things like animals and machines that they think are not conscious, which they can then unplug. But I think that's a kind of human-centric bias. Anyway, it's used in many different ways. And in order to do science, we have to start by finding one decent way of understanding it. So I'm going to select one prototypical meaning of the notion of consciousness, which is the meaning that I think a normal adult uses when he says, I'm conscious of the red light that I'm stopping in front of as I drive my car. Okay, so I'm driving my car, I see the red light, I press on the brake and I stop my car, and I admire the redness of that red light. That is what I mean by being conscious of the redness of the red light. So I'm talking about that kind of definition of being conscious of something. I'm not talking about people in comas, people in locked-in states, vegetative states or other stuff, pathologies, not people who are dreaming, in trance states under hypnosis. I'm not talking about babies. This is a problem. I'm not talking about young children. Different definitions may apply to them. I'm not talking about animals. We can talk about that later. So what does it mean to be conscious about something? So let's take a concrete example. I'm in my kitchen and I want to wash the dishes. I need a soft sponge. I pick up the sponge. I check if it's soft. Is it soft? I'm attending to the softness of the sponge. What is actually happening there when I say I'm conscious of the softness of the sponge? What does that really mean? What do I mean? The first thing I think we mean, well, there are three things: the self, attending, and the phenomenal feel aspect. Let's talk about the self. The self. What is the self? Is the self a mysterious thing? Having a self? Can machines have selves? Well, a lot of psychologists, neuroscientists, philosophers, social scientists have worked on the self over many decades already. So philosophers like Hofstadter, Dennett, Metzinger have all got theories about what the self is. The self is a complicated and sort of self-referring entity. And Hofstadter talks about these strange loops. Metzinger has these books which are impossible to read about the self, making it sound very, very complicated. And then you have really interesting books by kind of philosophically oriented social psychologists like Hacking and Parfit. And then you have, it's called the import theory of Wolfgang Prinz about the notion of self being, in fact, in other people. Anyway, the self has been much studied, and globally, the idea which seems to be well accepted, okay, is the self is a story. It's a cognitive and social construct that facilitates interactions between people, between agents. It's a story that tells itself. Now, that may sound curious, but it's not so curious if you think about countries. France is a story that French people have agreed to tell about France. Okay? A country can be formed by a group of people getting together and saying, we're going to form a new country, we're going to call it X, and then once they've done that, then that country becomes a real thing, and it has causal efficacy. It can act, it can do things, it can wage wars. You talk about countries very much like one talks about a self. So it's not a mysterious thing, and one can do science about it, and these philosophers and scientists have done it. Okay, so it's not mysterious. The notion of self, I'm going to leave that aside because I think that with the appropriate cognitive ingredients, machines, you could build them that have a self. There's no problem. So I'm going to leave that aside. Now there's another aspect about me being conscious of the sponge, and that is the fact that I can only be conscious of the sponge if, the softness of the sponge, if I am at this moment paying attention to my experience, okay? If suddenly the doorbell rings, while I'm doing this, I would then be being conscious of the doorbell. I would not be conscious of the softness of the sponge at that moment. So what we mean in everyday life by being conscious of something, we have to have the notion of attention that is necessarily involved. And now attention is something that psychologists have been studying, again, for decades. This is a typical task that psychologists use when they are studying attention. This is your test here, whether you can pay attention properly. Your task here is to follow the coin around underneath the cups as they move around. You have to pay attention. That's what attention is, paying attention. And I'm going to ask you at the end where the coin ends up. And maybe it's a bit confusing because of the all the hands rushing around there. Okay, so did you find the coin? Do you know where it is? There. Okay. Now, how many of you saw the green pepper? 3 or 4 or 5 people saw the green pepper. There was a green pepper. Let me do the video again. Now, watch out for the green pepper. So this is a phenomenon called inattentional blindness. Because you are paying attention to the coin, you do not see the green pepper, which moves across the scene in full view. Where is it? There it is. Now, it was in full view, and you simply did not see it. Now, that, of course, I could have shown you the famous gorilla video, where your task here is to count the number of times the ball bounces, and then you don't see the gorilla that walks in full view. And about 50% of people don't see the gorilla. And this marvelous demonstration was done by Simons and Chabry. It's absolutely brilliant. And it shows the importance of attention in being conscious of something. Now, so that's the second aspect. And together with the self, the notion that in order to be conscious of something, you need the self and you need attention and this cognitive access. Philosophers call it access consciousness, that combination. Actually, they don't talk too much about the necessity for the self, okay? But it's implicit in the notion of access consciousness that there must be a self involved in this attending. And again, is this access consciousness, is this attending mysterious? Can we build it into robots? Is there any reason why we should not be able to build this into a robot? Well, there's a lot of work being done by physiologists and by neuroscientists and by psychologists on the notion of cognitive access. There's the famous global workspace theory by Bernard Baum, which dates back to the 1980s, which has been developed more neuroanatomically by Stan Duane and collaborators, and which has been perhaps currently the most important theory of trying to model this access consciousness, and it's very successful and well considered. The idea essentially is that and you have mechanisms in the brain that are able to attribute attention to certain processing on the left. But when these mechanisms are isolated and not communicating with each other, when the information is not integrated across the different modules, you're not conscious. But when you have this ignition and everything talks to everything else, then you get this conscious phenomenon. So essentially, their idea is that conscious access involves having attention plus global integrated access to information throughout the brain. And then there's some other theories which are also influential. The higher order thought theory, which is totally compatible in many ways with this global workspace theory, and predictive processing, which is a more recent theory where prediction is kind of integrated into the thing. And again, it's not incompatible with this theory. And then there's several other less influential theories. There's this very good review article by Durig and collaborators, hard criteria for empirical theories of consciousness, which is worth reading, which reviews all these different theories. But the point is, these are scientific theories. They can be tested, and they show that the notion of conscious access, cognitive access, is a scientifically testable notion, and there's no reason why one should not build it into a machine. So it's not mysterious, and I'm going to leave that aside as well. Okay, so now, the last part is phenomenal consciousness. So what is this phenomenal aspect of consciousness? It's the real raw feel. Okay? It's the redness of that red light. It's the hurt of the pain. It's what it's like of the sound of the violin. You know? It's the feel. It's the feel. So what is it? Now, the problem with this phenomenal aspect of consciousness, the raw feel, is that it's difficult to define. You know? What are feels like? If a Martian phoned you and said, listen, I've never been to Earth, I want to know what red feels like and how it's different from green, what would you say? You know, how is green different from the smell of an onion? These are questions that you can't answer. In fact, you can't even be sure that other people have the same feel when they see red as you do. They might have the feel that you have when you smell an onion or when you see green. Many people have asked themselves whether my red is the same as your red. Okay? So philosophers use the word ineffable to say that. Ineffable means it can't be described. And also philosophers have talked about what they call qualia, which are the qualitative aspects of these raw fields. And they say that because they're ineffable, qualia poses a deep philosophical problem. Okay? You can't describe them. How can you do science about something that you can't describe? How can you ever be sure the theory is right if you can't talk about what the field really feels like? So that was one problem about these fields. A second problem is, how could they be generated by the brain? Okay, this softness field, okay, presumably it's created by a nervous influx coming from my fingertip, going up into maybe the area of my brain that's sensitive to touch, in the somatosensory cortex. There's a finger area, and there must be something about the neurons in the finger area which, when they feel softness, generates this softness feel. What is it about those neurons generating the softness feel rather than the hardness feel? Okay. Could it be something about the oscillation frequency, which is different for hard and soft? Suppose it was the oscillation frequency, or whatever neural mechanism, maybe something about the neurotransmitters. Suppose it was some mechanism. Okay? Then I could ask, why is it this mechanism? Why is it this frequency of oscillation rather than that one that causes the softness rather than the hardness? Or in the visual cortex, there's an area devoted to color, V4. And now, supposing there's certain excitation is for red and certain other excitation is for green. What is it about the red excitation that gives redness rather than greenness? And supposing you had a theory, yes, well, it's something to do with the type of neurotransmitter. This neurotransmitter gives you red, that neurotransmitter gives you green. Why? What is it about the neurotransmitter that gives red rather than green? Well, maybe it's the extra nitrogen atom in the neurotransmitter. Why? What is it about the nitrogen atom that gives you red rather than green? There seems to be an endless series of questions you can ask. There seems to be no scientific way of checking any explanation that you might make that could apply. And so because of this difficulty in understanding qualia, what it's like, many scientists, philosophers, have resorted essentially to the same strategy that was used at the beginning of the 20th century about life. People in that time couldn't understand what generated life in certain systems. And so they invented this vital spirit that they thought was perhaps the only way that they could think that there was some new basic entity in the universe called the vital spirit that had the property of generating this mysterious thing called life. And scientists these days have a similar approach to consciousness. They say this is so difficult, phenomenal consciousness. What we're going to do is suppose that there is some new phenomenon in the universe, and, for example, Hameroff and Penrose think it's a quantum gravity effect in neuron microtubules. And when you get this orchestrated quantum collapse in the microtubules, you have this kind of micro consciousness that's generated. That's their idea. And then you have Edelman, who thinks that it's something about reentrant loops in thalamocortical loop system. Or Canoni, whose theory is very well considered by the general public, has a special mathematical concept that he calls integrated information, and when it goes beyond a certain threshold, he says consciousness emerges. And Chalmers, a philosopher, goes even further, and he says, well, actually, everything is conscious. Even atoms are conscious, and when you put enough of them together, like in a brain, then the brain becomes conscious. So all these approaches, essentially, are analogous to the notion of vital spirit, because they don't really explain anything. They say, well, since we can't explain anything, we're going to assume there's a new basic phenomenon in the universe. Now, maybe we have to do that. After all, in physics, we did postulate, elementary particles that cannot be explained otherwise. But it's a tricky thing, because actually it's not satisfactory. If you have a certain basic entity that explains maybe why you're conscious and why, rather than not being conscious, well then how are you going to explain the difference between red and green? Since you can't say anything about red and green, nothing to compare them because they're ineffable, okay? You're going to need to say, well, this basic concept that generates consciousness has got to have two different basic fields, one that corresponds to red and the other that corresponds to green. And since we can't explain it, we're going to have to postulate two different aspects of that general concept. But what about pink? What about green? What about the smell of onions? For every different field we have to postulate another basic universal property of the universe. We're going to have an infinity of these different things. So this is not a productive scientific approach. So what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong is qualia, the whole idea that fields are ineffable. We've essentially, as scientists, shot ourselves in the foot by saying, well, what we really mean by fields is something that cannot be talked about. As soon as you say, well, I want to investigate something that I can't investigate, it doesn't make much sense. And I don't know why philosophers have been going round and round and round in circles trying to talk about qualia, because it's just logically nonsensical. You cannot do science about something that you cannot talk about, you cannot have objective consensus about. Okay? So the language of qualia doesn't exist by definition of qualia. And so there can be no scientifically verifiable link with neural mechanisms in the brain. it's just that the language of science cannot talk about something that cannot be talked about. Hence, what the philosophers call the explanatory gap or the hard problem of consciousness. So you've got to get out of this somehow. And in my book, which you can download off my website for free, I propose what I call a metaphysical shift, just like the metaphysical shift necessary at the beginning of the 20th century, where people abandoned the vital spirit, and it was the birth of modern biology. The idea was we're just not going to think that there is something magical about life. We're just going to say life is a collection of capacities: metabolism, replication, metabolism. All these things are different facets of baggage concept, the concept of life, which an outside observer attributes to a system and says, that system is alive. But life is not in the system. The system is alive because I look at the system and I see that it has certain capacities. And when systems have those capacities, we say, from the outside looking at it, it's alive. The life is not in the system. Okay? And there is no single thing like life. And so the idea is that we have to think in that same way about consciousness. So the standard view then is that consciousness is generated by brains, and then consciousness is things that happen to us, and that the feels, the qualia are ineffable. We can't talk about them. That's the standard view. And I'm suggesting the sensorimotor view, which is feeling is not something that happens to us. It's a thing we do. It's interacting with the world. And by talking about feels as skills or modes of interaction with the world, feels can be described just like I can describe what I do when I ride a bicycle or drive a car or chew chewing gum or whatever I do. I can describe it in lots of detail. And in the same way, we're going to talk about feels as things that can be described because they're things that we do when we interact with the world. Now, that doesn't sound quite right. Okay? So it's difficult to see how we're going to make that metaphysical shift. So to help help you understand this, let's take the example of the softness. Okay? When I say I'm conscious of the softness, what do I mean? Well, I mean that I, as a self, am cognitively attending to what I'm doing. Now, what am I doing when I'm feeling the softness rather than the hardness? What distinguishes what I'm doing when I feel softness from what I'm doing when I feel hardness? Well, the answer is obvious. When I'm feeling softness, when I press, my fingers goes into the sponge, it squishes. Whereas when I'm feeling hard, it doesn't squish. There's something different in the skill that I'm exercising when I'm feeling the softness. I'm interacting with the sponge in a way which I call the soft way of interacting with the sponge. And I actually don't have to be doing it all the time. I start squishing the sponge and then I stop squishing the sponge. At that moment, I'm actually doing nothing. And yet, I'm still feeling the softness. Because I know that if I were to squish, then the sponge would seed under my pressure. Just like when I go camping, okay? I'm going camping. What am I doing right now? Actually, I'm not doing anything. I'm sitting in front of my tent, drinking my coffee, okay? But I'm still camping. So it's a potential. Why am I camping? And how do I know I'm camping? I know I'm camping because if I were to stand up, I could go into the tent or out of the tent or pack it up or whatever. It's a potential action that I could do. I don't have to be doing anything. Okay. So let's see how this different view of what feeling is works. Let's see how we can solve the two problems that we had with phenomenal consciousness. One was, how do they differ? They're ineffable. Well, obviously, okay, let's ask. So how does softness differ from hardness? Okay, why does the sponge feel soft, not hard? Well, if you press with your fingers, the sponge seeds under your pressure, whereas if it's hard, it doesn't. So The reason it's soft is because there's something about the interaction that distinguishes it. It's not ineffable. I can tell it's an objective fact about what I'm doing. There's nothing magical about the difference between hard and soft. Okay? Why do you feel the sponge on your hand rather than on your foot? Okay? Well, what does it mean to feel something on your hand rather than feeling it on your foot? It's not that the information is coming from the receptors on your hand or on your foot and exciting different areas of your brain. You would be back to the explanatory gap, because then you'd have to say, if you adopted that view, because if you adopt that view, you'd have to explain what is it about the nerve cells in the somatosensory cortex that makes it feel hand-like rather than foot-like. No, we mustn't go along that path. Okay, what distinguishes hand feeling like and soft and foot feeling like are these sensorimotor laws. What do we mean by feeling something on your hand rather than on your foot? Well, what you mean is that if it's on your hand and you move your hand, the sensory input changes. But if you move your foot, nothing happens. There's no change. You feel it on your hand because if you look at your hand, then there's a correlation between the modulation, the changes that occur on the sensory input coming from your hand and the visual input, or even the auditory input. These sensorimotor correlations constitute the hand-likeness rather than the foot-likeness. It's nothing much to do with the channels via which the information is coming, or the nerve centers in the brain that are involved. Why does it feel like a tactile feel rather than a visual feel? Why is it a touch-like feel? Well, what do we mean by touch? And what do we mean by vision? Having a visual feel, what is it? What do you do when you see? Well, you move your eyes around, you move your body around, and you notice that when you move your eyes or you move your head, there's immense automatic immediate changes on the input coming into your brain, because your eyes are moving with respect to the outside world, okay? But if you move your hand as you're seeing, there's no change of the information coming into your brain. So what you mean by seeing is, rather than touching, is that, well, it depends strongly on eye movements, on body movements. If you blink, the information is interrupted. That's what's meant. Of course, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to move your eyes. You don't have to move your bodies. You just have to be in a state where you know that if you were to do it, then you would, there would be these changes. Okay? Okay, so we have an easy answer to the question of what it's like, how to feel different. They are no longer ineffable. I crossed it out. The quality of our feels are constituted. They are nothing more or less than all of the laws that potentially apply when you are interacting with something using some sensorimotor laws. Let's look at the second problem. How could feels be generated by the brain? Okay, well, what's the answer to that? When I drive my car, for example, I have the feel of car driving. Why? Well, because what I mean by having the feel of car driving is I do this with the steering wheel, I shift the, I shift the gears, I press on the brakes, etc., etc. Car driving is constituted by those sensorimotor laws. Is that feel generated by the brain? Would you go and look in the brain to explain the difference in feel between car driving and tractor driving, or between car driving and motorcycle driving? No, it's ridiculous. What you mean by car driving is entirely constituted by the things that you could possibly do when you're in a car. And it's different from tractor driving and motorcycle driving by the things you do. The way to talk about feels is not by anything going on in the brain. Of course, stuff is going on in the brain, but that's not where the explanation lies for the similarities and differences. And it's ridiculous to try and think about feel as being generated by the brain. It's just not generated. It's a philosophical category error. as Gilbert Ryle, the philosopher, would say, to think that fields are generated by anything. Fields are not the kind of thing that can be generated. So the wager of the sensorimotor approach is to take this view, this sensorimotor view, to all types of experiences. Okay? So I'm going to try and go through a few examples of how this view can illuminate various phenomena and problems in psychology or neuroscience. I'm going to talk about some applications of this approach. And I'm going to try and show you that it's not just philosophy, but it makes scientific predictions and helps understanding stuff from an empirical point of view. So one of the obvious things, and it's actually via that I started thinking about all this many years ago, concerns with defects in vision. You all know that there's an enormous blind spot in the retina of each eye. It's as big as an orange held at arm's length. It blocks out your visual field. And most people think that the reason you don't see this blind spot is because the brain fills in the missing information. That is wrong. If you think about seeing as interacting with the world and establishing sensorimotor laws, okay, then you have to realize that seeing is not taking a picture that is projected on the retina and reprojecting it somewhere in the brain where there's a big hole where the blind spot is, and then you have a kind of interpolation mechanism in the brain that fills in the regions, the missing regions. Thinking about it that way is the classical approach. I'm saying you should think about it more the way you think about touch. So here, I have my hand. I touch the table. It's smooth. There are no holes in the table. But look, all those blind spots between my finger. Does it come to your, as a scientist, would you look for interpolation mechanism in the brain that fills in the gaps between my fingers, that explains why I don't feel holes in the table? Seems stupid. Why does it seem stupid? It seems stupid because we consider that feeling the table is an active, exploratory, interactive interaction with the table. You look at it already in the forms of this interaction. You don't need to postulate compensation mechanisms in order to understand why the world seems visually perfect despite the blind spot and despite all these other terrible defects in the visual system. Helmholtz, the great Hermann von Helmholtz, my hero, lived here in Berlin. And he said that, he thought about this problem. Anyway, why am I talking about Helmholtz? I'm confused. I put in Helmholtz somewhere. Yeah, he looked at the non-homogeneity in the retina and the eye movements and all this. And I got distracted there. I have to go back to my talk. What was I going to say? Anyway, there are all these defects in vision. Oh yes, Helmholtz said that if he was an optician and he had an eye and he looked at the defects in the eye, he would, as an optical instrument, he would throw it away immediately. It was so full of defects. The eye is a horrendous piece of optical machinery. It has tremendous optical aberrations. Color is almost completely absent in peripheral vision. You think you see colors in peripheral vision, but color in peripheral vision is really bad. Colors are really only present in the fovea. That's not the impression one has, okay? Eye movements, terrible. I mean, just think of the shifts and blur that occurs on the retina and the displacement of the visual world. You would think you need compensation mechanisms to overcome these defects. Well, if you think about vision more like touch, then you see that it's no longer necessary. None of this is necessary. And yet you have decades of scientists who've been trying to work on compensation mechanisms that compensate for these defects. Another application that I studied was sensory substitution. As I said, you can, the reason you feel things on your hand or rather than on your foot is to do with the sensorimotor correlations. The reason you see rather than you hear is due not to the areas of the brain that are involved, but to the sensorimotor laws that are involved. So if you could build machinery that replaces the laws of vision by the laws of audition or the laws of touch, you should be able to see through your ears or see through your skin, which is what I've studied in some of my articles. And also I've done some work on how the brain might construct a notion of space. You could look at that. But today I want to look at just some simple examples. The example of tactile projection is the first one I will look at. So remember I said the reason you feel the sponge on your hand is to do with the sensorimotor correlations. In other words, the perceived location of a field is determined by sensorimotor laws and not by the location of the sensors. Now, an example of that, of course, is the blind man who walks along the street with a cane. He or she feels the street or the curb using his cane. Where does he feel it? Where does he feel it? He's actually only feeling it in his hands. But that's not where he senses it. He senses the curb and objects outside of him at the end of the cane, right? And not in the hand where your stimulation is actually occurring. And what about this? Why do you see the world outside of you? After all, if it were like touch, the sensation is being captured by the cones and rods in the retina. Why don't you feel the world on your retina? You should feel the world on your retina, not outside you. Right? Why do you see outside you? If it were like touch, you should feel it on the retina. But you don't. Why? Because the location is not what determines where you see things or feel things. And when you drive a car, you're sitting in your car and you park it, and you feel the curb hitting the back tire of your car. So it's as though the feel of your body has been projected out onto the car. Or you write on a rough or smooth paper with a pen, where do you feel the smoothness or the roughness? You feel it at the tip of the pen, not in your hand, which is touching. So these projections are, it's in a way, it's incorrect to talk about projection, because there is no projection, there is no mechanism involved. It's just that what we mean by feeling things in this place or in that place is the fact that the sensorimotor laws that explain what's going on are best accounted for in terms of the location of the stimulation, which might be here or there, depending on what the nature of the correlations is. And of course, that corresponds to this phenomenon that maybe a lot of you know, these illusions of ownership. This is the rubber hand illusion. The video I got off YouTube, which is very nice, where you have the experimenter here in the green shirt who's stroking the hand of a person who, it's a rubber hand that he can see in front of him that's being stroked at the same time of his own hand, which is on the other side of a partition there, so he can't see his own hand. He only sees the rubber hand. But because the correlations are perfectly temporally correlated, the illusion that the viewer gets is that the rubber hand is his hand instead of the real hand. And so when somebody comes and stabs the rubber hand, the guy thinks it's his own hand, and he takes his own hand out. And this illusion has been much studied over the last decades, called the rubber hand illusion. And it is established very quickly within the minutes of the beginning of the stroking. And in fact, you can even get the thing to work with whole body illusions using video cameras and stuff. You can get it by stroking somebody's back, and he sees somebody else's back being stroked in front of him. You can get the impression of having an out-of-body experience, and that your body is outside of you. So these are lots of interesting things that the sensorimotor approach can easily explain. Now let me come to something else, which I'm very, very proud of, because it really concerns the hardest problem in phenomenal consciousness, which is red. Okay? Philosophers take red as the blue cusp. What is the redness of red, and why does it feel red rather than green? Okay, and I've already explained, that there's no point in looking into the brain to explain that. Okay? So what could you possibly do in order to conceive of the redness of red not as something happening to you, but as something you do? It seems ridiculous. But with a very clever mathematician, Philippona, we had a brilliant idea, which is actually not so brilliant at all because color scientists knew this all along, which is that red is not the wavelength of light coming into your eye. It is not. In fact, what you hear in school about colors is just wrong. Red is the way red things change the light. That is what red really is. And any color. Colors are not in the wavelength. Colors are in what you do when you move colored surfaces around under different lights. So I take this piece of paper, it's red, and I turn it towards the yellowish sunlight. And the light coming to my eye is more yellowish because it's coming from the sun. Some of the sunlight has been absorbed by the paper, but what remains comes into my eye. And now I move the paper towards the reddish incandescent light or the bluish skylight. The light coming to my eye is now more reddish or more bluish. The spectrum of the incoming light is modified by the light, by the absorption characteristics of the red piece of paper. And in fact, the light coming into your eye is totally different. And yet you see it as being one color. Okay? Independently of how you move it around in the different lights, you see it as red. So the redness is a kind of invariant that is independent of the light that's illuminating it. The light coming into your eye changing all the time. It's nothing to do with, or very little to do with wavelength. It's to do with these invariants of the reflectance properties of the surface. As a proof of that, many of you know the dress. Raise your hand if you think this dress is blue and black. Now raise your hand if you think it's white and yellow, or white and... Now, are you 100... Have you seen this before? So, most people thought it was blue and black. Those who saw it as white and yellow, are you absolutely convinced? Can you possibly see it as being red, black and blue? No. That's why it was such an amazing phenomenon. This was an exceptional example showing that the same wavelength of light coming into your eyes can be interpreted totally differently with no sense of doubt whatsoever. Okay? This was a really interesting phenomenon. And it's totally compatible with our view, this theory about what color is. So what color is a 3x3 matrix. That is what color is. The 3x3 matrix is the sensorimotor law that describes how that surface changes the incoming light. Let me explain it. If you look directly at the yellowish sunlight, three different photoreceptor types that are sensitive to color, the L, M, and S, long, medium, and short wavelength receptors, will respond in a certain way. And that response can be described as a point in three-dimensional LMS space. So the yellowish sunlight corresponds to the incoming light, which is a point in the three-dimensional input space. Some of that light gets absorbed, and then it comes out of the piece of paper, and you look at it directly, and again, now your L, M, and S cones will be activated in a different way because of the absorption characteristics. So you have now the output light is described by another point in three-dimensional LMS space, right? And the law that maps the input point to the output point is very accurately, because this is all linear, it's a 3x3 matrix. And so you can calculate, and I say this is the sensorimotor law. It describes how any input light is changed into an output light. You can look at the different color chips used by color scientists, And you can calculate from first principles the absorption characteristics of the pigments used in these chips, and you can calculate what the 3x3 matrix is from first principle. Not psychology, it's not sensations, it's physics. From the physics, you can get the 3x3 matrices for each chip. Okay? And then you can plot those 3x3, you can then analyze mathematically those 3x3 matrices, and you can notice that some of those matrices are what mathematicians call singular. Singular matrices have the property that they project points in a three-dimensional input space to a lower dimensional output space. A singular matrix takes a point in the three-dimensional space and projects it either to a line or a two-dimensional subspace of the three-dimensional output space. There are 4 of these muscle chips that have that strong degree of singularity. I plotted the muscle chips down below on the base plane here, and I've plotted the degree of singularity on the z-axis, and you can see that the red, yellow, green, and blue muscle chips are singular. Okay. Now, that is totally amazing. Look at this graph. This is an empirical survey of which colors among those muscle chips are given names in cultures throughout the world. Non-industrial cultures, Amazonian Indians and stuff like that, sometimes only have 2 or 3 or 4 color terms. But if they have a color term, that color term will be red. And if they have 2 color terms, it will be red and yellow. There are 4 colors, red, yellow, green, and blue, which are given names in cultures throughout the world. And the hues, the exact wavelengths involved, spectral properties of those colors that are given names are exactly those same hues and colors that are predicted by the singularity. So I think this is totally amazing because philosophy that says color is a sensorimotor law has predicted from first principles an empirical anthropological result about which colors people in the world are going to consider to be the simplest colors. I think it's a victory of philosophy over science. And you can even, I don't have time to go into it, but if you go and look in the brain, there is nothing in the brain that correlates with red, yellow, green, and blue. There's nothing special about the excitation of neural channels in the color regions of the brain that correlate in any way with the red, yellow, green, and blue. The only thing that correlates properly are these sensorimotor laws. I think it's brilliant. Unfortunately, the color scientists don't like it. Nobody likes it. It's just too simple. Too simple. Okay, now let me talk about something else. Remember, there were 2 problems about phenomenal consciousness. We couldn't explain what it was like, and we couldn't explain how fields were generated by the brain. Okay? Actually, philosophers consider there's an even deeper problem. Why is there a field at all? You know? Why is there something it's like at all? You know? Couldn't the neurons in the brain that underlie field just not feel like anything? Okay. That is the problem philosophers call the problem of something it's like. It's clear to us, seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, and tasting give us a feeling of something being present. When there is something. It sort of makes sense. But people should say, well, it's something. It feels like something to me, and it's useful to compare that to thinking. So let's think about red. When you think about red, you don't have that something it's like. It doesn't have that presence, that sensory presence. And even more obvious is blood glucose, or thermoregulation, or oxygen level in your blood, or whatever, digestive processes, liver metabolism. These are things that are going on in your body or in your brain that are governed by sensory systems that are almost as, well, some people say the digestive system is a second brain. These are sensory motor systems that are perhaps as complicated as sensory systems. Why don't we feel them as being somehow present to us, like seeing, hearing, feeling, touching, smelling stuff? Okay? Now, if you were to look in, and also vestibular information, proprioception, the information about the positions of my limbs in space relative to each other, okay? You know where your limbs are, but you don't sort of feel them in the same way as vision or audition or smell. Why? If you look in the brain, you're lost. Okay? Explanatory gap, never-ending sequence of questions will be asked. Sensorimotor approach, you look at the sensorimotor laws that govern perceptual processes versus the ones that govern these ones that supposedly have less sensory presence. Okay? And if you do that, you realize that essentially the reason why there's something it's like to feel using your senses, your classical 5 senses, is that, well, why is it? It's because, as I said, what you mean when you say you're feeling something is you're engaged in interacting with the outside world. You're doing something. You're probing, you're exploring, you're checking that the sponge is soft, but you don't have to be actually doing anything. It's a potential check, okay? But you're engaged. Whereas when your blood has some oxygen in it or not, you as a voluntary self are not engaged in checking it. In fact, you can't, because you don't have cognitive access to the direct cognitive access to the oxygen level. You are engaged in interacting. Okay? So, but how do you know? How do you know whether you are currently engaged in something? Okay? Bodyliness, insubordinateness, and grabbiness are 3 aspects of your mode of interaction with the world that prove to you that you are currently engaged in interacting with the outside world. Bodyliness is the fact that if you move ever so slightly your body, well, because your body has the sensors, the visual, tactile, etc. sensors on its body surface, the relation between the sensors and the outside world changes the minute you move your body. So they're exquisitively sensitive to any movement of the body. So a way of checking that you are not dreaming, for example, is when you move. And when you move and you notice a change, well, that's sort of a proof that you are really interacting with the world. Okay? So bodiness is a first aspect of a proof that you are currently interacting really with the world. Okay? But there's the insubordinateness. If you really are interacting with the world, not only does your movements of the body change the incoming information, but also if you don't move, the information can also change, because the world has a life of its own. It can change by itself. Okay? And then there's grabbiness. There's the fact that it so happens that in our biological systems, the sensory systems, vision, hearing, touch, smell, and taste, are equipped with hardwired sudden event detectors, transient detectors, okay? That if you suddenly have a flash of light in the visual field, it immediately attracts your attention. Your eyes automatically move towards it. The same for audition, touch, taste, and smell. Strong changes attract your attention and interrupt. It's like an interrupt in a computer. It interrupts your current cognitive processing. You are somehow dependent on the outside world because of the way that your brain is hardwired to be sensitive to sudden transients. And this is not true of thoughts, for example, or imaginings. Your thoughts don't kind of wake you up in this attention-grabbing way, okay? Because your thoughts are completely under your control. And also the vestibular, proprioceptive, and autonomic sensory pathways are also not connected perhaps to frontal areas that govern your cognitive processing. And for that reason, these aspects of what's going on in your brain and body do not have the capacity to interrupt your cognitive processing. They have no grabbiness. So for example, we said that some voluntary body motion systematically changed sensory input. Insubordinate sensory input can also change without body movements. Grabbiness, sensory channels can incontrovertibly capture attention. Notice bodyliness and insubordinateness kind of go together, and they're a measure of the fact that we are only partially in control of the information coming into our body. We can control it only partially through our body motions. So if you then look at how this explains why certain things going on in your body and brain have a feel or have this sensory presence versus not. You can see on the left I plotted the degree to which a feel could have bodyliness, insubordinateness, and grabbiness. And you can see on the first column, seeing, hearing, feeling, touching, tasting, and smelling. They have bodyliness, they have insubordinateness, and they have grabbiness. And that's what we mean by there being this sensory presence. There's something it's like. Thinking has none of them, because the thinking is entirely under your own control. You can't be surprised by your own thoughts, or sort of difficult. Glucose, etc. So this sort of explains why the 5 classic sensory systems have something it's like. What they have like is sensory presence. Oh, grabbiness. Let's talk about vision. So obviously vision has bodyliness, as I explained, insubordinateness, grabbiness. This is what's interesting. And this is where I made this discovery of change blindness. So here, this shows the grabbiness of vision. If something changes in the visual field, it immediately grabs your attention and you see it. But if you were to make an experiment where, by some artificial means, you cut out the grabbiness of changes, you did something so that the brain no longer attracted your attention to these changes, well, then you would not see. Because seeing, what you mean by seeing is knowing that potentially whatever is there can grab your attention. So if it can't grab your attention, well, then you can't be seeing it. And that's what happens here. Here, there's a part of the picture which has been changing so slowly that it doesn't stimulate the grabbiness detectors in your brain. So I don't know, did you see there was raise your hand if you saw there was a change. Almost a third of this picture, of this image, has changed since I put it up. A third of the whole picture was different. What was it? If I make the change suddenly, like now, you see that the whole ground plane here was red at the beginning and it changed to blue. You didn't see it. Why did you not see it? You didn't see it because seeing is not having a representation in your brain being active and seeing it because something is active in your brain. Seeing is nothing to do with activation in the brain. Seeing is exploring, probing, testing, knowing that what is there is what you think is there. You know? So this phenomenon is called change blindness. And I discovered it some years ago with Ron Rensink and Jim Clark. And since then, there's been a lot of work and different ways of doing the changes. So in this demonstration, instead of doing the changes so slowly, what I'm doing is I'm flashing these what I call mud splashes on the thing. And many of you will probably not have noticed that there's something else that's changing in the image, and it's this line in the street which is changing from solid to solid. So that's typical. Now, this related question is this. So how come, that red ground plane in the first picture, how come you saw it as, despite the fact, you saw it continually, how did you see the ground plane continually, and yet it was changing in color? It was either red, or how could you continually feel that you felt the redness, if that's what you saw, of the ground plane, when actually it was changing to green? So seeing has this ongoing feeling. It's like the camping, okay? I'm camping even though I'm not doing anything. I've got my eyes closed. I'm not doing anything, yet I'm camping. The same is true of seeing. I'm seeing the ground plane. Why? Because so long as I don't ask myself, is it red or is it green, I assume it's whatever color I thought it was to begin with. It's like the light in the refrigerator, okay? You open the refrigerator, the light is on. You close the refrigerator door. Is it on? You open it, on. Close it. You think it's on all the time. And that's why the occurrence, the ongoingness of vision, the ongoingness of our sensations derives not because there's some ongoing stuff in the brain. The brain is not some kind of purring machine like a motor purring whose activation corresponds to this ongoing consciousness. Nothing need to be going on in the brain. All that has to be going on is when I ask myself, am I seeing the red? Then you get the appropriate information. So that was change blindness. Now I'm going to come to the end here. This was my most recent work, is what I call an analytic phenomenology. So I'm trying to take this notion of sensory presence further, because this is really the favorite question of philosophers these days. You know, if you go to philosophy conferences on consciousness at the moment, everybody wants to know why there is something it's like, and do we really have to postulate some brand new physical property of the universe like panpsychism or quantum gravity effects in microtubules in order to explain this mysterious thing, okay? So I'm trying to convince people there's no need, because, okay, what we call the something it's like of these 5 sensory modalities can at least partially be explained by this notion of sensory presence, which is to do with the properties of the sensorimotor laws involved in seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, and feeling, okay? But actually you could ask more subtle questions. What about thinking and remembering? I mean, does thinking and remembering not have something it's like? You know, perhaps it's not sensory presence. Perhaps it's a kind of more mental presence. It's quite different from glucose in your blood, which you really don't have any consciousness of at all, okay? Maybe we should be more subtle. And in fact, let's look at other goings on in the brain, like hunger and thirst. These are certainly strongly felt. Pain, okay, pain. And then emotions like anger, fear, disgust, etc. We need to account for those, okay? Obviously, they don't have sensory presence. Maybe they have what one could call bodily presence, or mental presence, or some combination of them. So that's what I've been trying to work on more recently. And essentially, I've tried to generalize this notion of sensory presence. And as I said, the pair of bodiless and insubordinateness, if you think about it, it's actually a measure of the degree of control we have over our environment by moving our bodies, okay? But since I want to actually talk not only about sensory phenomena, but also mental and bodily phenomena, I want to generalize the notion of bodily action and talk also about mental actions, okay? And I want to, so instead of talking about sensory-motor interactions, I'm just going to talk about actions. And an action can either just be a bodily or a mental action. And the effect, I can be moving my body, but I can also move my mind. I can think about things, right? And instead of taking bodiliness and insubordinateness, which involved voluntary body movements, okay, and the notion of sensory input, I'm going to talk about any kind of action with your mind or your body. And I'm going to talk about any kind of input coming through the nervous system, not just sensory influx, but information flow, okay? And so I'm going to look at the balance between bodyliness and insubordinateness as an indication of the degree of control that we have over the information flow in our brains through voluntary body or mental actions. So this degree of control, I'm suggesting, should be an objective measure that a physicist can come in and with an oscilloscope, he can measure the information flow and he can measure the body or mental movements somehow. So that's one factor. And the other factor that I'm going to have is grabbiness, which stays sort of the same, except instead of saying loss of voluntary control over the body, but I'm going to talk also about loss of voluntary control over attention and loss of voluntary control over my motivation and drives. And that's the subject of a paper that I published recently in 2023 in Frontiers about how voluntary control over information and body movements determines what it's like to have perceptual, bodily, emotional, and mental experiences. So as I was saying, I've got these two factors, controllability of information processing via actions and controllability of actions themselves. And these things, I claim, explain or are constitutive of what we mean when we say that there is something it's like. And it sort of explains the ongoing, occurring, real, lived feeling that we have when we're having real feels. And why these feels affect us either as being outside of us in the world, in our bodies, on our bodies, in our minds, or even more generally as persons. And I think that this grabbiness, this generalized version of grabbiness, explains also why these feels impose themselves on us. They seem felt, what it means to feel. They occupy us, they are present, they are displayed to us from the outside. I don't have time to go into the detail. Let's plot let's take all of these different kinds of feels. The classical sense modalities, pain, itches and tickles, emotions, and then primary homeostatic urges like hunger and thirst, visceral phenomena like blood pressure, oxygen, digestion, proprioception, vestibular sense, and then mental thoughts and mental states like I feel confident, I feel resolved, I feel confused. These are all things whose what it's like I would like to be able to explain by my two factors there. Okay. Now clearly here I've plotted a graph that shows the degree of control over information flow that I have through voluntary body and mental actions. And here I've plotted how fast this degree of control acts. So as I said, vision, audition, touch there's a lot of bodyliness and a lot of insubordinateness, which means that there's only partial control and it over what's going on in the information flow. And this loss of control is very rapid, so it's fast. So this is why I plotted this here. Taste and smell a bit slower. Pain, itches, and tickles is even slower. Anger, fear, and disgust, it's slower, and I put it lower down because we have less and less control in these cases. But we can discuss about that, and you can look at the paper. But essentially what I'm saying is that what we call a current experience, one that seems to us to be going on right now as we experience the visual field, will be in this region of fast loss of control, fast partial control. And something which is slower will be down here, like hunger, thirst, feeling sad and happy, or anger, fear, disgust. I think I can explain why the what it's like has a more state-like feel rather than a more current, ongoing nowness. And then, interestingly, I can explain why these are not experienced at all, simply because there is no control, there is no voluntary control. And similarly, mental states and proprioception, we are under complete control. So it's this balance between complete control and no control, which gives us things that we really have strong what it's like. And then if I look at the grabbiness, the generalized grabbiness, then I can explain why pain, itches, tickles, hunger and thirst seem so bodily critical to us. So I plotted that. That would be the z-axis of this graph coming out towards us. Pain, itches, and tickles, they are wired up to immediately capture our mental and cognitive processes. You can't, if you have a pain, you just can't think normally, okay? And that completely changes your mental dispositions. It affects your actions. You no longer move in the same way as you did if you sprained your ankle. It affects your attention, and it changes your motivation to do things. And those changes in your actual mental capacities, bodily capacities, mean that pain, itches, and tickles are bodily and mentally imposing. That's what we mean. These objective measures of what's going on in the brain correspond to these subjective impressions of what it's like that we have. There's an equivalence. This constitutes what we mean by the what it's like of pains. And hunger and thirst. And interestingly, one interesting thing concerns the grabbiness of these classical senses, because actually here, if there's something suddenly that occurs in the visual field or in auditory input, we have what's called orienting reflexes. This is not like pain, where our cognitive activities just are interrupted. Here, the orienting reflexes for eye movements, for example, actually they assist in the processing. In the visual field, your eyes are attracted to areas of strong contour changes, strong contrast. And this helps you scan the image in a way that accumulates more information. So in a way, this assisting aspect exists in addition to the alerting aspect. And these are hardwired into the visual system. And similar things occur in other sensory systems. That's why I've put a kind of frame around them to say that's why we feel these 5 sensory modalities as being somehow displayed to us from the outside. Okay? They're not like bodily fields inside of us. They are displayed to us from the outside. And they give us this illusion, like for the color of the ground plane there, of everything there being continually and simultaneously present. Impression of displayedness. Okay, so that's sort of, we're getting to the end now. So in summary, the sensorimotor approach consists of defining or redefining what we mean by being conscious of something as having a self, who's attending and cognitively accessing an experienced sensorimotor law whose qualities constitute the experience quality. Sensorimotor laws that explain how feels differ and why they have presence. And the advantages of the approach is that it bridges the explanatory gap, solves the hard problem, explains what feels are like, why there's something it's like rather than nothing, and it generates scientific research paradigms and makes predictions. So what are the takeaway points? Consciousness is not all or done. There's no spark, like the spark of light, that is either present or not. It's a collection of capacities, okay? And they are different depending on the degree of development of myself and the types of bodies and drives that I have. Okay? And they can be present or absent to different degrees. Second point, consciousness is not inside brains. In a way, you could say it's a way of talking about other people's capacity to interact with the world. And I then attribute what I see in other people to myself. And that's when I say I am conscious. My consciousness is not in myself. It's an attribution that I make to myself, looking at other people, looking at me. Interesting. Still, this feeling of I having consciousness is very real and is a very useful social construct. The brain does not generate consciousness, just like there's no vital spirit that generates life. What does the brain do then? Well, it enables all the processes that underlie what we call the notion of self, cognitively accessing, and the processing and underlying and exercising sensorimotor skill that determine the quality of experiments. Now let's get to the ethical issues. Are animals and very young babies conscious? No, not according to the definition I've used. Okay. Why? Because they have no self. The self was absolutely essential. In the case of a baby, a newborn baby, because the self is a social and cognitive construct, it can't have a well-developed self. So when you say that the baby has a pain, well, you're using that word conscious of the pain in a completely different way from the way adults use it when you say, I'm conscious of the rhythm. Unfortunately, if I'm making a scientific theory of consciousness in this way, I unfortunately have to exclude babies and animals who don't have selves. It just does not make sense to talk about a baby having a pain. You have to read it. If you want to be a scientist, you've got to stick to the same definitions, okay, unfortunately. Do animals, young babies, feel pain? No, not like adults. There's no well-developed sense. There's nobody in the cockpit, to feel the feel. That does not mean that the babies don't react, and their bodies are biological systems that adapt to the physiological stresses, okay, and they adapt in various ways, okay. But they cannot be said to feel in the way we feel as adults. So obviously, does this mean we should not anesthetize babies? Does it mean we should allow infanticide since there's no self? Does it mean that we should euthanize people who don't have cells, who are mentally disabled? These are tricky questions. Okay? That is a problem. My view is that it's a mistake to take consciousness as a grounds for ethical respect. Consciousness, first of all, is very badly defined, and everybody uses the word differently. Okay? And it's, as I said at the beginning, it's a way we can discriminate against things we want to eat. We say, well, that animal doesn't feel the pain, so I can slaughter it. Just like in the Middle Ages, the Spanish conquistadors said the American Indians have no souls. Okay, Christ has not appeared to them, and they are therefore they don't have souls, and so we can. They're animals. In fact, they're machines. We can use them in our sugar plantations to make money. And it was very practical because since the notion of soul was not well defined, well, they could just chop up the Indians the way they wanted. And that's what we're doing, people today are doing with consciousness. They're using consciousness in the way that suits them for their purposes. But this is wrong. I mean, if you want to make a scientific theory, well, you have to be consistent. So I think you have to simply admit, oh, and also consciousness, we say we don't eat, I don't know what, we don't eat apes because they're conscious like humans, virtually. But that's, I mean, we kill criminals who are conscious. We wage wars on conscious enemies. The consciousness is not actually used as a criterion for respect. It's hypocritical to invoke consciousness as a reason for not having abortions or for not killing off children. It's hypocritical. So what we have to do is to use humanitarian, social, and cultural criteria to judge these tricky issues. We just have to take our responsibility. Consciousness is not a criterion. Okay. Now, the whole talk was supposed to be about conscious machines. As you can see, I don't have much time. But I hope to have convinced you, okay, that there's nothing mysterious about consciousness. We just need a few vital components. Unfortunately, currently, large language models are not conscious. Why? First of all, they have no selves, okay? And secondly, they have very limited reasoning and abstraction ability, and they're not socially integrated. So, and they cannot have a normal human-type feel because they don't have real bodies that interact the way we do with the world. So even if they did have the first things, they wouldn't feel things like we do because their bodies are different, okay? But this will be remedied in the next few years. I say within 5 years, we're going to have these problems solved. After all, we have thousands of brilliant engineers like you who are working on what's wrong with current large language models. And we're going to solve these problems of lack of reasoning and abstraction ability in the next 5 years. And when we put these machines in a social context where they can abstract the notion of self, then we will be very close to having machines that have a self, that can attend to things. They can, if you put robots connected to them, they will be interacting with the world, maybe with their steel hands or whatever, but they will be very close to being able to have this conscious feel like human. So when they do end up like this, will they have feel and will they have emotions like humans? Yes, but they will be different from ours. Their bodies will be different. Their physical worlds will be different. Their social interactions will be different. They will not have the same basic drives as we do. They may have different types of interactions with the world, but their fields and consciousness will be just as real to them as they are to us. So in conclusion, consciousness is thought to be something special, but it's not. It's a collection of diverse capacities, each of which can be explained within current science. Some new unknown mechanism is necessary, people think? No. If we consider phenomenal field, which is the great mystery, everything we do rather than a thing that happens, then we would postulate no new mechanism. And we are far from making conscious machines? No, they're coming. They're coming in the next few years. That's it. If you want to learn more about my approach, you can download my book, and you can download this article from my website. Thank you very much.